Hello and most welcome to 1277. We will continue the trodden path and go in more to what is the bodily consequences of a structured universe, so to speak. First, AT inhibition often refers to embodied states, whereas executive inhibition doesn't necessarily depend on muscle tension or support. Some of the experiences described by Alexander teachers cannot be explained based on the current literature on exhaustive functions. For example, Walter Carrington suggesting that the more up you can give him with your hands, the easier you'll make it for him to inhibit. An experienced AT teacher once commented to me, "Of course, you can't inhibit without directing, where directing refers, roughly speaking, to an intentional focus on posture and muscle tone." Second, most adults are pretty good at executive inhibition, whether they are AT practitioners or not. By contrast, inhibiting what Alexander technique teachers call misuse is extremely difficult, as Alexander found out when he tried to inhibit tensing his neck before speaking, even when Alexander was quietly working on his own. The neck tensing habit would return despite his best efforts. Alexander teachers report that changing habits of misuse requires consistent work over periods of months or even years. Being good at executive inhibition is clearly not sufficient to be good at Alexander technique. There must be something about the kinds of patterns we try to inhibit that makes them particularly thorny. Given these facts, the central question about Alexander technique inhibition is not what is executive inhibition, but rather why is inhibiting misuse so difficult? Finally, the extensive research on executive function cited above does not include studies of the Alexander technique, while studies have established positive results on inhibitory control with disciplines like mindfulness and yoga. No one, to our knowledge, has published measurements of direct effects of 80 lessons on executive inhibition. Luckily, we have at least 3 practicing research scientists who have a strong research interest in the mechanism of Alexander technique, as well as a rigorous training in Alexander technique. Below are 3 of their experiments that shed light indirectly on the more psychomotor sides of Alexander technique inhibition and end gaining. While the results of all 3 of these experiments should be considered as preliminary evidence rather than proven fact, these studies considerably deepen our understanding how inhibition and end gaining relate to embodied phenomena in Alexander technique practice. Part 3, experiments on inhibition and end gaining. The first example comes from Rajal Cohen at the University of Idaho. She and her graduate student, Jason Beer, were able to correlate anticipatory postural movements, goal-oriented tasks, and psychometric tests of inhibition and mindfulness. As trained and experienced AT teacher, Dr. Cohen designed this experiment in part with end gaining in mind. Cohen's team monitored head, neck, and trunk positions in quiet standing with no explicit goal, as well as before and during a simple goal-oriented task. Walking towards a platform with a tray and setting it down at elbow height. They also made the task more challenging by having subjects also place the tray on a low platform or prevent a cylinder from rolling on the tray while walking. Subjects were also separately given several standard inhibition and mindfulness tests, such as the Stroop test that you took above. Cohen's group found several things. They discovered a clear anticipatory tendency to pull the head forward towards the task before walking even starts, for which there is no obvious biomechanical reason. It is as if people want to move their head toward the goal before they even get started. This effect increased as the challenge of the task increased. Furthermore, the research team found correlations between shortening of the neck during movement preparations and worse performance on general inhibition tests. Finally, they found correlations between habitual neck alignment and scores on both inhibition and mindfulness tests, with worse scores associated with more forward head posture and a backward tipped head. In short, poor inhibitory control is associated with disruption of the head-neck relationship in both anticipatory movement and static posture in healthy young adults. Given the range of measures in this experiment, one doesn't want to read too much into the results immediately. The correlations, while statistically robust, show that postural measures account for only 15 to 20% of the variations in psychometric scores. The experiment is innovative and novel, with potential for a whole new direction of groundbreaking research. One of Baer and Cohen's hypotheses is that there is something particularly deep-seated about the tendency to pull one's head towards a goal. That their paper speculates that this tendency may be an evolutionary remnant from our quadrupled ancestors, for whom leading with the head to sense food or threats would have been biomechanically perfectly reasonable. Such an explanation, while speculative, would account for the results of other published studies, such as those that we find forward head posture in both concentration and stress tasks. This is a difficult hypothesis to test directly. Future measurements of diverse populations, tasks and conditions might clarify the phenomena. Dr. Ian Loren, proactive inhibition of neck muscle activity. Second, let's look at a study carried out by Ian Lorem and his team of researchers at the City University of Manchester. Lorem had violinists use real-time ultrasound images to monitor their neck musculature movement during tasks of varying difficulty in their instrument. They were instructed to minimize changes in this neck muscle movement as if they played and performed the various movements associated with playing. None of the violinists had any Alexander technique training, and no instructions were given on what the image meant or how to change this neck activity. The results were amazing. Without even knowing what the thing was, they all managed to lower their strain and therefore widely improve their ability to play and direct their music. Dr. Cacciatore describes the problem differently. His analysis suggests that slow standing exposes a complex interference between the postural system's stabilization strategy which stiffens the hip, knee and ankle joints, and needs of the movement, which requires deep hip flexion and activation of the extensor muscle. According to Cacciatore's analysis, it is the highly trained postural system of 80 teachers that allows them to succeed at the task, not their ability to inhibit per se. In other words, a student who constantly lurches out of the chair may be missing postural skills rather than the ability to inhibit. Once the student learns these skills, inhibition of the old habit becomes possible. This would explain quotes we've discussed above, such as, "The more up you can give him with your hands, the easier you'll make it for him to inhibit." And of course, you can't inhibit without directing, where the words up and directing refer to the reorganization of postural support. This model of the postural system functioning in tandem with a planned movement system suggests a particular way to think about inhibition and endgaining when faced with a problem such as standing up from the chair with feet far forward. It is more intuitive and simple to try to plan a movement-based solution rather than a posture-based solution. Furthermore, unskilled movers may not have the necessary skills to communicate with a postural support system and maintain those messages during movement, what AT teachers might call maintaining direction in movement. Given this, they resort to a momentum-based solution, a lurch to overcome stiffness, rather than undoing the stiffening reaction itself. Within this model, endgaining could be defined as focusing on the movement system rather than the postural system to solve a problem. Cacciatore's analysis challenges some assumptions about why students fail at slow sit to stand. Are they lurching because they are endgaining, because they lack the proper stabilization patterns? to meet the support needs of the task, or some combination of these factors. This question seems extremely important from a pedagogical perspective. Discussion and conclusions. Let's summarize some key points. Learning Alexander technique is a high-level cognitive motor process with multiple components. Alexander technique involves working with some particularly thorny habits having to do with goal-directed behaviors and postural support. Learning to overcome these habits requires a high degree of motivation, sensitivity, and understanding of body signals. Understanding of the psychomotor nature of goal-oriented tasks. Practice in communicating with the underlying support system and a calm mental focus. Executive inhibition explains certain phenomena associated with Alexander technique inhibition. This is clear from quotes such as, "What we mean by inhibition is stopping your initial response to the idea of something you want to do or have to do. But it is only part of the story, especially when referring to states of muscle tension and movement or persistent states of calm." Cognitive flexibility along with inhibition is also important for AT teachers to consider when talking about Alexander technique learning. For example, the creative shifting of strategies that Alexander used to address his neck tension is a beautiful example of cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is also required in AT lessons when confronting and changing misconceptions about postural states, referred to by some teachers as faulty sensory appreciation, in terms of persistent effects due to at Alexander technique lessons. The philosopher John Dewey is claimed to have found it much easier after he had studied the technique to hold a philosophical position calmly once he had taken it, or to change it if new evidence came up warranting a change. This is an anecdotal example of improved cognitive flexibility through lessons. Unlike in science, the intertwining of mental and bodily processes often plays a central role in Alexander technique teachers' descriptions of inhibition, which explains in part the importance of this word in Alexander technique parlance. It refers to more holistic processes than executive inhibition. The ability to inhibit specific patterns of muscle tensions, as explored by Loran et al., may lead to cascading effects. This might amplify the power of selective inhibition, since one can learn to inhibit unnecessary neck activity to reap benefits throughout the body. The correlations between posture and inhibition come from the work of Baer, suggest that refined proactive inhibition is necessary in preventing maladaptive postural habits. The authors also point to evidence that extreme forward head posture makes reactions happen more quickly, suggesting that postural habits might influence inhibitory responses proactively. In other words, there is an initial scientific evidence that inhibition affects posture and that posture affects inhibition. These connections between postural and cognitive states are not well understood, but are of interest to scientists. They are fundamental to AT. So you see clearly here how the physics, the paradigm, leads to a specific characteristic misuse that can almost be countered, understood from the bodily perspective. How sharpness of thinking disappears in the misuse and thinking becomes habituated, repetitive, coarse, non-sharp, dull, just as our whole bodily system become duller, less directed. An Indian might say it is lacking of prana, lacking the force, the life force, lacking time, is to use a term from Unger / Smolin. There is no longer time, and therefore directionality is also a no thing. So quantum mechanics taken the right way might take away those frictions and stops for a healthy and intellectually rewarding life. I wish you all a very pleasant night, and thank you very much for your patience, me trying to talk and inhibit at the same time. At least this time I manage fully the time to have a 50-50% distribution of weight over my 2 feet. Thank you very much.